Let's get started with regions and zones. So building a global footprint. To understand the AWS global infrastructure, let's go back to our coffee shop. So let's say you have multiple coffee shops, right? So one of your coffee shops goes down. There might be an event such as a flood, power outage, or maybe a parade, right, that overwhelms a particular coffee shop. But if you have multiple shops, then customers can still get their coffee by going to a different or nearby location. This is exactly how AWS Global Infrastructure works. Let's go ahead and watch this video on AWS Regions. You can pause and then we'll jump back in. Gonna go ahead and go to the next slide. All right, so what is an AWS region? An AWS region is a geographically distinct area where AWS hosts its infrastructure. Each region will have multiple availability zones. Typically, we're talking 3 or more, which are isolated data centers that provide redundancy and fault tolerance. So, by having multiple zones, similar to multiple coffee shops, if one of those zones were to go down, your data wouldn't be lost, your service wouldn't go down. It would simply transfer over the traffic into another availability zone. So that's why it's fault tolerant. So in case of some kind of disaster, right, whether it's too much traffic, whether it's an actual disaster, right, at the data center, having multiple gives you a backup essentially. That's where redundancy comes in. Redundancy, for example, when we're storing long-term data, like in a cloud drive, redundancy means that if you have it in multiple places, if one of those places, fails, is corrupted, is destroyed, that data is not destroyed, right? Because we back it up in many, many places. So when you're choosing a region, you have to consider a few different factors. As we see, right, AWS can be provisioned all over the world. But when you're actually, we already started an EC2 instance, for example, when you're actually launching an instance, you have to choose a region. So how do you choose a region exactly? Well, some things you have to consider is proximity to customers. It does matter, right? As we've seen that when it comes to cloud infrastructure, there is real physical infrastructure connecting the cloud, right? So the closer you are to your customers, the better latency, speed, right, experience that those customers can have. Now, that's not to say that you can't serve customers all over the world, right? But if you want to have the best customer experience, you're definitely going to want to choose a region that's close to them. It's just what makes sense. Another one is compliance with data governance and legal requirements. So again, if you're working with sensitive data, if you have to follow really strict licensing requirements, if you're trying to follow some kind of rules or laws, then the region that you choose might matter, right? Some laws might not allow you to go and take your data outside the country, right? For example. So this is where choosing an AWS region is important. Not all services are going to be available in all regions. Some regions will be more limited in the services that they offer. So it is important when choosing a region to consider what services you're going to need. And of course, there's pricing. Different regions will have different pricing. Compliance. So compliance refers to the process of following laws, regulations, industry standards, and internal policies that apply to an organization or system. As we talked with choosing AWS regions, if you're trying to comply with these rules, that's part of compliance, right? Following the rules, making sure that you're doing everything you're supposed to, so that you can serve customers, right, in the proper manner. So depending on your company and location, you might need to run your data out of specific areas. For example, if your company requires all of its data to reside within the boundaries of the UK, then you would choose the London region. That'd be an excellent place. So not all companies have location-specific data regulations, so you might need to focus more on the other 3 factors. So not so much the compliance factor, but more the proximity, the services, and the pricing. So proximity, so that's selecting a region that's close to your customers. That's going to help them get their content the fastest way possible. So if your company is based in DC, many of your customers are in Singapore, you might consider running your infrastructure in the Northern Virginia region to be close to the company headquarters, but actually your apps, your EC2 instances, you might run those in the Singapore region. So it's all about provisioning your resources in the right place. So remember that while compute resources are delivered via the cloud, the internet is still built on physical infrastructure, so location matters, right? It does matter, right, how close this hardware is to your customers. All right, so available services, like we said, so sometimes the closest region might not have all the features that you want. AWS is frequently innovating, right? They're adding new services, they're expanding on their current suite of services, and they're adding ones to regions all the time. However, right, making new services available around the world sometimes does take time and requires AWS to build out the actual data centers, right? And they do that one region at a time. So, for example, Amazon Bracket, it's a cloud quantum computing service, so one of the newer services. Currently, it's not yet available in every single AWS region around the world. And then pricing. So, of course, pricing is not going to be the same across different regions. So, in this example, you can suppose that you're considering running an app in both the US and Brazil. The way that Brazil's tax structure is set up, it might cost 50% more to run the same workload out of their Sao Paulo region compared to the Oregon region. So you'll learn in more detail that several factors determine pricing, but for now, all we need to know is that the prices aren't the same between regions. So go ahead and watch this video on availability zones, and then we'll pick up right after.